I try to answer him with equal kindness. I feared that she suffered more than me. Kiel was under the daily bombardment of the Allies, and I knew that she must be hungry all the time due to the rationing of the war. Instead, although I worked like a slave, I had food, a roof, and did not have to worry about a bomb falling on my head. In autumn, the Americans assigned me the worst job imaginable, field work for which I was not made, just as I wasn't made to be a soldier in Germany. I had been trained in trade school to work in accounting and purchasing. Now I planted onions in vast hectares with Mexican migrant workers under the hot Texas sun. The closest I had come to gardening was helping my mother plant some tomatoes in her small garden. The Mexicans who ran the rose plantation worked quickly and efficiently, planting small onion after small onion throughout the day. The roses they planted were straight and uniform, like a grid. The only way I could keep up with them was by throwing whole bunches of small onions into small holes. I hoped no one would remember what my rows were like when the green stem sprouted, but I kept going because I was paid 80 cents a day in canteen vouchers. After trying to keep up with the Mexicans for a week and suffering nausea and headaches every night, I looked for an easier job. Once again, God was with me, and my opportunity came, a temporary position as a translator for an American sergeant named Ruth Rock. He was an overweight guy with eyes that almost disappeared into his wrinkled face. I learned that Ruth Rock wore a large brown hat worn by instructors in the American Army. Ruth Rock was in charge of work assignments for prisoners of war. He called roll and sent the prisoners to their daily tasks while talking, chewing tobacco, and spitting out his drawn-out Texan vowels. Punctuated by guttural sounds very different from my British pronunciation. We barely understood one another. To make sure he understood me, I tried to stop speaking with a British accent and speak American, not realizing that I had also learned his colloquial expressions. I said this and that, and you guys and all the other catchy words I had heard him use until that moment. I consider my knowledge of English to be an advantage for surviving as a prisoner of war in the United States. But then a serious incident occurred involving one of my barack mates, Corporal Hugo Kraus, 24 years old. Hugo also spoke English and, from time to time, acted as interpreter for the camp commander. Hugo had lived in New York with his immigrant parents from 1928 to 1939. Then he returned to Germany, where he felt more comfortable. He went to school to become a tailor and worked in that trade until he was drafted. Oddly enough, while Hugo was in the African Corps fighting the Allies, his parents became citizens of the United States. When Mr. and Mrs. Kraus learned that Hugo had arrived in Herne, they were euphoric. Since Hugo was a German citizen and soldier, he was not granted special privileges, but his parents were allowed to visit him in the camp. They brought him smiles, hugs, and a sewing machine. My friend Hugo was delighted with his gift and settled into the business. Word quickly spread that Hugo could make custom uniforms, shirts, and caps with his new American sewing machine. Our barracks soon had a steady stream of visitors wanting to transform their baggy military uniforms into elegant, fitted suits. Then one night after blackout, we woke up to a big commotion. What was happening? I jumped out of bed and ran toward the crowd surrounding Hugo's bunk. He was bleeding and unconscious. What happened? I asked a man in a bunk near Hugo. Some guys threw a blanket over his head and beat him with board from the floor. It all happened in minutes. I couldn't believe I had slept through it all. Who were they? What were they like? I asked. It was dark. He pointed toward the door. They ran out there and disappeared. I don't know who they were, the man said, shaking his head and averting his gaze. He returned to his cot and covered his head with a blanket. The medics came running and took Hugo away on a stretcher. I never saw him again. The next morning they told us Hugo had died at the hospital. It was rumored Hugo's death had been registered as murder by unknown people. Rolf thought Hugo's American connections seemed like treason to the Nazis. I was shocked to my core. His poor parents must have been devastated. A fanatical German paratrooper from the next barracks seemed the most likely suspect, but it was dangerous to even stick your nose into such matters. After the end of the war, I read that several German prisoners of war had been guilty of Hugo's murder and hanged in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Hugo's murder made it clear that fervent Nazis were among us and made me realize I was in more danger from my German compatriots than from my American captors. The gentlemen were most dangerous, because the Americans did not watch our barracks. After Hugo's murder, I felt even more vulnerable, especially in my bed. I couldn't relax, as if I was still in Africa. I slept very lightly, attentive to the slightest noise, as were my closest friends. Since I had been a friend of Hugo, I was terrified that the murderers would make me their target for that reason, or for my work as an interpreter for the American military personnel. I found Ralph the next morning and said to him, "I'm leaving." "What are you going to do? Are you going to escape?" "No, idiot. I'm going to another camp. I have to see this myself." I managed to be transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Mexia, Texas, with other prisoners from Hearn. My choice did not turn out well, since it turned out that a German officers' camp was attached to the normal Mejia camp. We had barely made our bunks when they strutted into our barracks. We had to get up quickly to greet them with a military salute. "Be in your barracks in an hour," a high-ranking officer said as he watched us. "Some of you will be chosen as our valets. You will have to wash our clothes and clean our rooms." Full of themselves, they went out the door. My companions and I looked at each other in amazement. "We had not survived the war to become servants," I said. "Me neither," said another newcomer. "I say we don't do it. Let's see if they dare force us," he shouted, pushing a bed against the door. Another threw a chair over the bed. Caught in the moment, we used all available furniture to entrench ourselves inside. An hour later, the officers came to see what was taking us so long. We huddled against the barricade. After much pushing, hitting, cursing, and shouting orders, the officers gave up and retreated. We made a victory gesture with our thumbs. We were finally on a winning team. We laughed and shook hands. "Mejia is not going to be so bad after all," I said. "I doubt those guys, officers or not, will risk being ridiculed again." Our small group headed to the dining room, thinking we had won a small skirmish. Our euphoria did not last long when we woke up the next morning and learned the officers had prepared a surprise. They kicked us out of the camp, put us on another train, and sat us in another Pullman car. I wondered what was going to happen next. Once again, I had no idea where they were taking me or what awaited me upon arrival. I reinforced my determination to take the reins of my survival. A guard told me that volunteers were needed in the train kitchen. I seized the opportunity. Any action was better than doing nothing. I tried to be optimistic. The train ride was a respite from the barbed wire, watchtowers, and unpredictable pools. I thought of it as a vacation. In the end, the train trip was all that and more. While I was peeling vegetables, the train window in front of me became a moving image in my new education. I saw a part of the United States that I didn't know existed, fresh, clean, and new compared to Europe. Every night, after a good dinner, I stayed awake as long as I could to look through the darkness at the lights of the towns, cities, and farms that sped by. With relative freedom, my kitchen companions and I could relax and enjoy the fleeting days. The United States of America intrigued me. What surprised me most was that America had managed to prosper, even in times of war. I would have loved to stay on the train throughout the war, but my short vacation ended when the train stopped with a whistle in Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the spring of 1944. Back to the real world, harsh reality prevailed. I observed a huge camp that should have been called an army metropolis. My small group was greeted on the train by guards who escorted us to an administrative building. I struck up a conversation with one of the younger guards who told me that inside Fort Knox there was a prisoner of war camp built for the Italian PAs, but that Italy had changed sides and had gone from the Axis to the Allies, so the Italians were no longer captive and wore American uniforms with a badge that said Italy. So we arrived at their enclosure. The guard showed me the barracks where, he said, the soldiers from northern Germany slept. I poked my head in and introduced myself. The boys inside told me I was in the right place. Two of the nicest and most helpful guys in my barracks were Seppel Fritz Wolf and Private First Class Ernst Schlatter. Fritz was about 35 years old and was from Leipzig, the city of the famous fair from the World Exposition. He was a veteran with 6 years of service in the army. Fritz had served in it before being captured. Ernst was from Brittheim and was about the same age as Fritz. He had served for more than 5 years and had been trained on the new Nebelwerfer rocket launcher before being sent to Africa, where he waited for it to arrive. Both had served in France and Poland before being sent to Africa. I found a bunk near the ones Fritz had indicated to me, even though they were older and veterans of previous campaigns in Poland and France, but they were optimistic and positive about our situation, like me. They just wanted peace and to go home to their families. From the first night, I ate with them. It turned out that they played scat, my favorite card game. We also played soccer, which was unknown to Americans at that time. Our young, nervous guards watched us with displeasure as we bounced the ball with our feet and heads. All the prisoners of war had learned to ignore the guards, who knew nothing about our customs and seemed to distrust and belittle everything they saw. Little did we know how their fear and anger would change our lives. As the first 500 Germans in Fort Knox, we were assigned to headquarters. My first job was in the headquarters laundry, where I met my first American civilians working for the United States Army. I didn't have much in common with them. Most were older and married. They immediately addressed me by my first name, something that, even among Germans of the same social class, could take months or years to achieve. If the Germans were of a higher social class, they would never allow someone like me to call them by their first name. I like the informality of Americans. The civilians' clothing was also more casual. The women seemed to have a lot of clothes and wore pants, while German women usually only had 2 high-quality suits per season. Although women on both sides of the Atlantic wore their hair styled in elaborate pompadours, like Hollywood stars, American women also differed in that they wore makeup and constantly opened compact cases to touch up. They wore a romantic perfume in a blue bottle called Evening in Paris all day long, and its aroma made me dizzy, although in the end I relaxed and talked and joked with the married women. I was too shy to talk to the few single girls who worked there. Obviously, they didn't notice me either, but I was happy to see soft female forms in colorful clothes again. For a whole year, all I had seen were uniforms. On their radios, they played pop music, and the American civilians joined the prisoners of war to sing and hum Don't Fence Me In, a Western ballad from Hit Parade, a 1944 radio show. That song and Sentimental Journey, also popular at that time, are still my favorites. Life in a prisoner of war camp was full of paradoxes. From my barracks, I could observe a smaller prisoner camp, located on the hillside, which was used as a fortification to imprison and punish soldiers of the American Army. They wore the same uniform as us, with a large P on their backs and blue caps. Every day, they entered our enclosure, heavily guarded, to empty our garbage, which undoubtedly made it clear to them what their place was. On the contrary, when my friends and I went to work inside Fort Knox, we had no guards. The American soldiers who had violated the rules of the American Army did not eat as well as we did. We felt sorry for them, and sometimes we secretly passed them candy. The American prisoners were soon moved elsewhere, and their old camp became a branch of ours. Except for the odd little slip-up like giving away candy bars, we followed the rules, kept to the schedules, and felt pretty safe. Life in the camp became routine. Soon, Fritz Ernst and the handsome safe. We needed Tiger Muttlichkeit and formed a gentleman's club. We kept raisins from the dining room to make our own wine by fermenting raisins, yeast, and water in a 1-gallon jar with holes in it. The result was a fairly potent wine that lifted our spirits. We serve each other our homemade drinks with encouraging toasts to the future. Unfortunately, the calm did not last long. After the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, large contingents of war prisoners began arriving in the United States. Many ended up in Fort Knox. Many of them were staunch Nazis, worse than the Germans of the Waffen-SS. Hitler's special forces captured in France also arrived. The SS were always willing to provoke fights. Hitler's special forces captured in France also arrived. The SS were always willing to provoke a fight for loyalty without quarter. Everyone was talking about Hitler, the Nazis, and the outcome of the war. Discussions and fights were common. Life inside the camp became dangerous for men like me, who only wanted peace and to return home to help our families. Other newly arrived soldiers brought stories, who had served in France and Poland before being sent to Africa. I found a bunk near the one that Fritz and Ernst had occupied. Although they were older and veterans of previous campaigns in Poland and France, they were optimistic about our situation. Like me, they only wanted peace and to return home with their families. From the first night, I ate with them. It turned out that they played scat, my favorite card game. We also played soccer. Other newly arrived soldiers brought stories of massive bombings of German cities, with numerous casualties and destruction. German retreat in Russia. The violence inside the camp intensified, especially after the failed attack against Hitler on July 20th, 1944, after his assassination attempt. Hitler no longer trusted his generals and made sure that the rest of his advisors were staunch and loyal Nazis. He launched many plans to keep the Nazis in power. One of them included the Nazis abroad. Hitler issued a new order. The worldwide military salute, with the arm bent and the hand raised towards the cap, was to be replaced by the Nazi salute, with the right arm rigid and raised. Previously, only the SS had saluted in that way. Hitler was able to extend his new order to the prisoner of war camps, as he knew that the United States respected the Geneva Convention. He sent the order regarding the military salute through the Red Cross to the U.S. government. From then on, German prisoners of war had to salute U.S. officers with a Nazi salute. U.S. officers must have hated saluting prisoners of war who were not Nazis. Hitler's manipulation of the Geneva Convention gave the Nazis in our camp a sense of power and control. A comment like "Hitler is a criminal" or "Germany will lose the war" could cost you your life in the blink of an eye at the hands of the SS. We had kept our mouths shut as civilians in Germany, and now we had to shut up as prisoners of war. More fights broke out when older men with their own philosophical and political opinions raised their voices. As a result, more of them had to be treated for serious injuries. It was not until the end of 1944 that the U.S. camp commander tried to stop the fighting. He gave orders over a loudspeaker. Anyone whose life or physical integrity is threatened by a fellow prisoner can ask the gate guards for protection. The meaning was clear. The Americans finally realized that they could no longer depend on the German non-commissioned officers to control the prisoners of war, who in turn had to face the same harsh reality. The non-commissioned officers were not as powerful as the SS, but the internal administration of the prisoner of war camps was still in the hands of the German non-commissioned officers, better educated and with more leadership experience. The logical choice should have been the German officers, but the rules of the Geneva Convention prohibited them from fulfilling this duty. The convention obliged the U.S. Army Camp Administration to have the prisoners of war appoint a representative or spokesperson to deal with them. We were never asked to propose candidates for this position or to vote on who should represent us. Before we had time to propose a candidate of our liking, an aggressive and politically experienced prisoner of war made his way to the position of spokesman for the German camp. Although the Americans did not know it, that particular non-commissioned officer was popular among like-minded prisoners of war for his stance in favor of militarism and loyalty to Hitler. Despite this turn of events, after the U.S. camp commander asserted his control, life in the camp stabilized again. He made sure that more equipment was offered for recreation, which gave the militants something to think about besides politics and war. Even privates like me were given more time for entertainment. The soccer players organized championships that were well attended. The space for a theater attracted actors and gave them an opportunity to hone their skills to entertain us. Some men disguised themselves as women and played those roles in musicals. We laughed until our stomachs hurt because the boys we knew gave their all in performances for our enjoyment. Once a week, we watched movies. We liked the Hollywood productions more than the German ones. We also had a small library with books that were banned in Germany. For the first time, I was able to read books by Jewish authors and anti-Nazi writers and thinkers, like Marx and Nietzsche. Hitler had suppressed Jewish and Christian religions equally in the camp. The SS and other Nazis considered religion an anti-Nazi activity, but that did not stop me from going to chapel. My friends began to come with sick and weary souls. Souls began to heal when they gave us a place to practice our faith together. The Catholic and Lutheran chaplains of the military prison held religious services on Sunday mornings for me, and I am sure that for others, it was a spiritual link with our families. While we were in our sanctuary, we could bow our heads and pray for the health and safety of those we had left behind. We prayed together for strength and courage to endure our imprisonment. The chaplains advised us to keep busy and not to think too much. The work part was easy, since all enlisted men had to work at Fort Knox. In August 1944, I got a job in an excellent kitchen, practically 4 stars. It was the kitchen of the headquarters unit, which had a German professional chef and a German professional pastry chef. I hadn't seen meals like those in years from the German pastry chef. I translated for the quartermaster sergeant, washed dishes and peeled potatoes, and ate like an officer. I was as satisfied with my work as possible under the circumstances. One day, I cut myself while peeling vegetables. The cut was deep and bled so much that the chef sent me to a young German doctor, well-groomed, handsome, with brown hair and blue eyes. Wolfgang was about 7 years older than I was. He had been a medical student before being drafted. His social class was higher than mine, but it took him a long time to clean, sew, and bandage my wound while chatting with me in an unusually familiar way. So, I know what kind of music you personally like. I really like Wagner, Wolfgang said as he stood behind me and began to massage my back lightly and press gently against massage. Lightly, no, I hadn't had much time to think about classical music, I said as I squirmed uncomfortably and turned around. I felt uncomfortable and turned around. He took my hand. Hey, no, I'm in charge here. I can free you from work whenever you want. Wolfgang looked at me strangely and said, all you have to do is complain of back pain and come to me. I ran out, confused. If Wolfgang was homosexual, how had he escaped persecution in Germany? Gays were sent to concentration camps. Could it be that he was so lonely that my masculinity was better than nothing? I never understood the situation or what Wolfgang felt, because I never returned when my wounds seemed to have healed. I removed the stitches myself in the prisoner camp, and it became a series of surprising events. I had no idea that sunny Sunday morning, November 5th, 1944, when I went to work, that the rest of the camp would be searched for the Nazi culprits who were brutally beating our comrades. The American camp commander was determined to find the Nazis, who had been so quick in their attacks and so cruel to informants that it had been impossible to catch them. My fellow kitchen helpers and I were unaware of the surprise count that took place while we worked. When I returned with some of my kitchen shift companions that afternoon, we were joking, unaware of what happened. Later, some friends from my barracks told me that the entire prisoner of war camp had to slowly pass under a balcony for the victims to identify them. Unfortunately, they could not identify anyone. Then they gave me the worst news. In the confusion, an American guard had shot my good friends Ernst Schlatter and Friedrich Wolf. No one could tell me exactly what had happened, but later, reading the New York Times of November 6th, 1944, the guard was described as having failed to convince the prisoners to leave the fence. The article went on to say that the guard had prevented a mass escape. This had to be a total invention. Not even the American civilians who worked at Fort Knox believed this version. Everyone knew that German prisoners of war went to work every day inside the military facilities without guards. I did it myself that day. The prisoners had been ordered to stay between the fences. That area was normally in no man's land. There was a trip wire 30 centimeters high, about 2.5 meters in front of the first fence, between us and the guards. That trip wire could not be crossed without the guards' permission in the towers. For example, if a soccer ball fell inside the trip wire zone, permission was needed to retrieve it, or there was a risk of being shot. During the many hours that the entire camp had been ordered to remain within the fence line, some prisoners of war had clearly provoked a guard. However, there was still a row of fences and barbed wire between the prisoners and the guards. The watchtowers had machine guns pointed at the assembled prisoners. It made no sense that Fritz and Ernst had done anything to deserve being shot. 50 years later, I still feel the need to set the record straight. Those men were my friends. The Americans held the funerals and burials the next day, according to Geneva Convention rules. We wore our German uniforms, and the camp commander gave us a German war flag to fold over the coffins in the camp chapel and then in the cemetery. While an American honor guard fired 3 volleys and played the funeral march, the American captain in command, who obviously disagreed, showed his contempt for our military rights by smoking a cigarette while standing by the graves as the coffins were lowered. I could not imagine that 20 years later I would visit the graves of Fritz and Ernst in Fort Knox as an American citizen. I shed tears for my friends by remembering them. A few years ago, I revisited their graves at the invitation of local historian and writer Gary Kempf. When Gary showed me the original New York Times article about Ernst and Fritz, I think I finally understood the discrepancy between the actual event and the report, since their deaths had to be reported to the International Red Cross. A public explanation was needed, and the news would undoubtedly reach the German government. The United States had every reason to fear retaliation if the incident was not covered up, as many American prisoners of war were being held in Germany. But all this is hindsight. At that time, I felt distressed, angry, and confused. After the funerals, we went back to work, more vigilant than ever. We discussed the shootings among ourselves and concluded that, unless the camp was searched again for the same Nazis, we had little to fear from the American guards, but we still had much to fear from the Nazis. In fact, we were so cautious that none of the English speakers in camp wanted to be the first to break the news of the New York Times. When Hitler learned that Soviet forces were approaching, he married his lover Eva Braun before committing suicide in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He told his aide that he did not want to be taken prisoner. Hitler's last act marked him as a truly evil man. He shortened his life to be remembered for what he perceived as the good he had done for Germany. He committed suicide so he would not have to face his failures. Back then, I sat on my bunk and felt my lips curl as I whispered as loudly as I dared. I didn't want to be taken prisoner. I couldn't face failure. And us? But I did not openly speculate on the meaning of this event. I could only hope that Hitler's death would quickly end the war. I crumpled the newspaper, kicked it a few times, and threw it in the trash. Finally, on May 11th, 1945, all the prisoners in the camp were gathered, and the American commander announced that Hitler had died and that Germany had surrendered. You're no longer bound by the oath you swore to Hitler. Maintain the good discipline you have shown here and continue to work well in your positions. He confirmed the truth of this momentous news and assured us of our safety in Fort Knox. At the same time, the commander went on to explain that there had been reports of shootings and killings by drunken American guards in some prisoner of war camps. However, he personally assured us that we were safe and added that headquarters staff had requested our immediate return to work, as everyone was needed to keep the camp running normally. He concluded by saying that our relations within the camp with the American military personnel had been harmonious, so we went back to work as if nothing had happened. But the American commander did not mention what we most longed to hear: how long they were going to keep us there. When were we going home? The questions echoed throughout the camp. Most of the prisoners of war felt that, in general, the Americans treated us fairly. The United States ruled the camps democratically and took every opportunity to open our eyes to this new concept. At the conferences, we were told that we had lived under a dictatorship. We were shown a series of educational films explaining democratic principles in words and examples. The difference between the German government we had known and the American one under which we lived was evident. To illustrate this, they even allowed us to write our own newsletter in German, which the prisoners of war mimeographed. The newspaper not only included a calendar of events and sports news, but also poetry, short stories, technical articles, crosswords, word games, and even classified ads. Freedom of expression had been suppressed for so long in Germany that it took us a while to put our opinions on paper and submit articles. The editor encouraged us to send in material. After Germany's defeat, they encouraged us to believe that it would be safe to express ourselves under American freedom of expression. Although I had never written for publication, I was still irritated by the injustice of my friends' tragic deaths, caused directly and indirectly by the Nazi prisoners. Ideas began to emerge in my head. Most of my thoughts revolve around a plan to put the Nazis where they belonged. They should be identified finally, both for our sake and for the Americans' sake. The Nazis should not have the same privileges as us, and of course, should not be sent home at the same time as us. My first and only article for the newsletter divided the Nazis into three groups. 1. Those who were longtime members of party organizations that had helped Hitler reach power. 2. those who joined after 1933 and benefited from their membership in the party or believed in the cause. And 3, those of us who never had the opportunity to vote due to our youth, since free elections had been banned after 1933. In my grief over the death of my friends and my enthusiasm to see my work published, I lost sight of the fact that freedom of expression in the United States might not extend to freedom of expression within a prisoner of war camp. I didn't think about the repercussions until I took my article to headquarters and began translating it into English for my companions there. One of them told me that the German camp spokesman had asked about me. My article must have touched a nerve. The non-commissioned officer belonged to my second category before the surrender of Germany. He presented himself to the prisoners of war as a staunch militant loyal to Die Führer. When Hitler committed suicide and Germany was defeated, he abandoned those beliefs and presented himself to the Americans as a cooperative and peaceful former German soldier, like the rest of us. I wanted to go home. I thought it wasn't worth the risk of being beaten or killed. I didn't think it was possible, since we were both imprisoned. What could he do to me 3 days after the newsletter's distribution? I found out the hard way when I showed up for duty. The sergeant told me they didn't need me anymore. The camp spokesman had pulled strings to get me out of my comfortable job in the kitchen. I was told to report to the engineer's post, to work on road construction. The sergeant also told me that I had been kicked out of the barracks and moved to the secondary camp that could be seen at the foot of the hill. I immediately knew what was happening. That building housed Axis prisoners of war captured in France and Nazi elements who had gathered there almost as quickly as they had arrived. In 2 quick blows, the camp spokesman had shattered my life, tore me from the camaraderie of my fellow Northern Germans, from the company of the kind kitchen helpers, and from the best food served in the officers' dining room. Now I was being sent to sleep in the old branch of the camp, populated by young SS members and members of the Russian Vlasov Brigade. Once again, I was walking the mental tightrope, watching every move and every word I said. My only hope was to contact the American intelligence officer. Where was he when I needed him? Probably eating in my old workplace. When I finally located him and informed him that I spoke excellent English and that I could be more useful elsewhere, it didn't change anything. I knew that the Russians carrying stones were former members of the Red Army and much tougher than me. They had survived captivity by the German forces, who had mistreated and underfed them. From the stories they told, I deduced that one of their officers was a former Soviet general named Vlasov who, after his capture by the Axis forces, had been persuaded by the high German authorities to form an anti-communist Russian army under German command. General Vlasov accepted the proposal on the condition that the new army unit would not face his former comrades on the Russian front, so they were sent to fight against the Western Allies in France. The Americans captured them, this time at the war's end. The Soviets demanded the return of the Red Army prisoners of war, which would undoubtedly lead them to death or life imprisonment with forced labor. I groaned inwardly at the thought of forced labor and prepared myself for more hardship. I showed up at the engineer's office to see where I had been assigned when I entered the building had been assigned when I entered the building. I asked someone along the way in English. I met Mr. Ashley, who came out with a big smile from his open office to talk to me, assuming, as I soon discovered, that I was the German bilingual who had applied months before. He explained to me that the separation center needed an interpreter to process the discharges of American soldiers. Why the hell would a German interpreter be needed for American soldiers' discharges? This became clear a little later. You're hired, Mr. Ashley. You can start right now. Thank you. I'm ready, I said, trying not to show how relieved I felt. I still understood what the job consisted of, and I was willing to give it my all. I wanted to be sure that, if Mr. Ashley discovered his mistake, he would still keep me. I soon learned Fort Knox had a large separation center for soldiers who had served enough time abroad to be discharged. I was surprised to see that German prisoners of war were in charge of the entire discharge process of the American Army. The prisoners performed medical examinations and even handed out the new Eisenhower jackets with the discharge logo. That is why an interpreter was needed then. A very insightful civilian, Mr. H. G. Null, supervised all of the German prisoners of war who worked at the center. He turned out to be the best boss I ever had. Mr. NAL was a cheerful and sociable guy, and, as I was his only English speaker, he chatted amiably with me, joked, and laughed about the camp's operation. He gave me the English name of Henry, and, after a few days, told me that he trusted me, Henry, and handed me the keys to his Jeep. He wanted me to take charge of the supervision of all the jobs assigned in Fort Knox. Although I had never driven a Jeep or even on a real road, I accepted the keys while thinking about how I could practice before my first day as job supervisor. The next few hours were a frenzy to find a German prisoner of war who knew how to drive one. My network of prisoners of war led me to Willie, a thin, nervous guy from Latvia. He promised not to tell anyone, thinking my trick was funny. The next morning, we quietly entered the vehicle park and took the Jeep out. Willie drove it to a field out of sight, and we switched places for the next hour. Willie shouted instructions at me and held tightly to the clutch. "Dance, reverses up, you idiot." "For God's sake, stop." I broke the gears, knocked down trees, and crushed posts, desperately trying to learn how to shift and reverse, until Willie thought I was good enough to drive without him. No one ever knew that I had only had an hour of driving lessons. When I left Willie at his workplace, he gave me a funny salute and a crooked smile as I staggered away towards my first post, shooting gravel everywhere. From then on, Mr. Knoll used to work in the office while I picked up the Jeep from the mobile park and drove to each post. After making sure everyone was busy with their tasks, I would sign Mr. Knoll's worksheets. By giving me freedom within the large military reservation, he helped me to feel like a human being again. I had total freedom inside the fort, but the barbed wire, just seeing it made me sick. On the bright side, I discovered every corner of Fort Knox, including the Women's Army Corps' dining room. Pure luck allowed me entry. The coat rack was in Mr. Knoll's office, where the Army field jackets and shirts that the American Army personnel left when the weather changed were normally kept. The garments came in handy when it started getting cold. Also, I noticed that everyone was much nicer when I wore those shirts and jackets. The guards even greeted me when I drove past the dining room. This encouraged me to go in and try to get served. There was no problem. The dining room staff treated me like any other soldier, without asking questions. Lunchtime became the best part of the day. I could sit, relax, eat well, and watch the girls go by. Mr. Knoll, who was a civilian, always took a black metal lunchbox with a matching thermos to his office. Before settling in the Women's Army Corps dining room, I had seen him eat dry American-style sandwiches made with bologna on white sliced bread, and he accompanied it with lukewarm coffee. I felt sorry for him because he was very kind to me. I decided to share my loot with him. He was eager to try it and wondered why it had never occurred to him. However, when I took him inside, we were immediately questioned and kicked out. It turned out that civilians were not allowed, and they also discovered who I was. It was my last visit to that dining room. Back in the Jeep, Mr. Knoll patted me on the back and said, "Henry, you're crazy." Apparently, he found the whole scene hilarious. I guess that, being a civilian, he never worried about Army rules, so he was always so good to me. Now I'll go back to the office and eat my lunch. "Do you have change for a couple chocolate bars?" he said to me, laughing. I had just lost my only advantage, and he was trying to cheer me up with a chocolate bar. I never forgot Mr. Knoll and all the favors he did for me. About 20 years later, my wife Jean and two of our children looked for dear old Mr. Knoll when we visited Fort Knox. As soon as we got to his house and he saw me, he exclaimed, "Henry, so happy to see you." He had been a wonderful boss, a relationship that became even more special because we were able to quickly overcome national prejudices and move on with life. Mr. Knoll treated me like any employee. He even assigned me a desk. The janitor, an old black man named Jimmy, called me Masa. To my surprise, I wondered if he meant master. If so, I had no idea that I was just a normal guy in my country. All I knew were the racial and class distinctions within Germany. My racial indoctrination there had not included black people. I was completely unaware of the extent of racial divisions in the United States at that time and was curious to know what men of other colors were like. We had been indoctrinated to instill in us the superiority of the Nordic race of northern Germany and the generic race of southern Germany. No true scientific racial classifications were taught, such as black, Mongol, and Caucasian, as this would have confused the Nazi hierarchy. Instead, we were taught to identify and treat our inferiors, some of whom were also Caucasian, such as Slavs and Jews. For example, Gypsies and all other races were included in a lower category. Blacks were never mentioned, as none lived in German-controlled territory at that time. Although my family was middle-class and Nordic, we were not privileged, nor did we feel superior. Since we were born, it was taken for granted that neither my sister nor I were going to receive a higher education, that we would always be middle class. To my surprise, Jimmy cleaned my ashtray for me, a simple private and former enemy. Jimmy didn't seem to care. If he expected social change, he didn't show it. Our lives as PWS did not change either, even though the war had ended. The worst thing about losing the war was not the reduction of food rations in 1945. They were still better than the ones we had in the German army. The worst thing was the lack of letters. Right after the end of the war, we were given a card with the inscription, "A former member of the defeated German armed forces is looking for his relatives." If we refused to sign it, we were automatically prohibited from sending or receiving mail. The men stood there, reading and rereading the card, trying to decide what to do. "I'm not a Nazi, but I'm not going to sign this. It's an insult," I blurted out. Looking back, I see that I was still somewhat indoctrinated and too impulsive for my own good. Yes, the boy is right. I heard the boys around me say, along with some of those who had not signed, that they were not going to sign it because it was an insult. "I'm not going to sign this. It's an insult," I blurted out. Looking back, I see that I was still somewhat indoctrinated and too impulsive for my own good. Yes, the boy is right. I heard the boys around me say, along with some friends. I tore my card in a sign of revulsion. For more than a year, I knew nothing more about the fate of my mother, my father, my sister, or my uncle. I was worried about my family, as my hometown was an important seaport with a naval base, a submarine shipyard, and the Walther Company, which manufactured rocket engines for various Air Force fighter planes, such as the NE-163 Comet jet. The city had been bombed since 1939. I knew from the prisoners of war arriving from France and the American newspapers that my city had recently been the target of massive aerial bombardments. What would I find when I returned home about a year after the cards, in the spring of 1946? The Americans convened a meeting for an important announcement. Finally, we heard what we were waiting for. "You can go home, boys." I ran back to my old barracks laughing, singing, whistling, dancing, and making music with anything melodic. We celebrated our liberation from captivity. We opened the last batch of raisin wine. That night we sang all the old sea shanties of the Baltic Sea. Soon a ship would take us home. Some of the prisoners of war among us were not so cheerful. Their states of origin had been ceded to other countries, and their families were refugees. One of them was Walter Breitkopf from Silesia. His home had suddenly passed into Polish hands, never to return. To make matters worse, he had spent months worried about finding his mother and sister, who had fled as refugees. Fortunately, the Red Cross found them. They were safe in my hometown. Walter located my barracks and became a good friend. Later, I helped him settle in Kiel, and he helped me when I emigrated. The hopes and dreams of seeing our families again were finally coming true. We started saving money to buy them gifts. What could I buy my mother that would be truly useful? I went asking the older men, and then we would get into long conversations about who we wanted to see first, what we would do first, and even what stories we wanted to tell first. And finally, we allowed ourselves to think out loud about the German girls. "I know exactly the type of girl I want," one would say, and then he would go on about a girl he remembered, her hair, her eyes, and her figure. "They are waiting for us, boys," the elders said. It has been a long time since they saw men like us. The jokes and excitement continued unabated. Many of us were children when we left home, and now they had not seen men like us for a long time. The jokes and excitement continued unabated. Many of us were children when we left home, and now we felt old. As for me, I turned 21 that year and realized that I should have learned more from my parents when I had the chance. Was my family still alive? The memories I had of them had given me hope, optimism, and a desire to survive. I was sure they were alive. I had prayed fervently for their survival. Mr. Null had been almost a father figure to me, and Mr. Ashley appreciated me. But I had to go home to help my parents, my Uncle Hani, and my sister Erica. Luckily, I was in the first group to leave, but one day, Mr. Ashley, frowning and worried, took me aside. "Henry, you don't have to leave yet if you don't want to. You are a good man. We need you here. You know we don't have enough interpreters." "Mr. Ashley," I told him, "I can't wait any longer. The sooner, the better." I told Mr. the same thing. No, that put an end to the matter. An edict was issued that came into effect immediately. It was mandatory to attend Allied documentary films about Nazi atrocities in concentration camps in Poland. The Allies wanted to make sure that all German soldiers knew exactly what had happened during the Hitler regime. Reactions to the films were varied.